We'll just wait a second or two while people rush through the doors of the ballrooms of Mars from the vestibule with their drinks, no doubt. Okay, good afternoon. I'm Professor Shane Darke, and welcome to the last of our weekly NDARC webinars for 2020, broadcast live, as you know, from the ballrooms of Mars. Now, fear not, however, as the NDARC Annual Symposium will unfold over the next 4 weeks, details of which can be found on our website. Now, while we are widely dispersed, we acknowledge traditional owners of country throughout Australia, recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. We pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Look, it's a real pleasure this week to be able to host Professor Anne Roach, a friend and colleague of many years standing, who's Director of the National Centre for Education and Training on Addictions at Flinders Uni in South Australia. Anne has over 40 years experience in public health, and she's worked as a researcher, educator and policy analyst, so she's a polymath. Prior to this, she's held academic posts at the University of Sydney, University of Newcastle, Queensland University, as well as Flinders. Now, for the past 35 years of her professional career, her activities are focused exclusively on alcohol and other drug issues. And Anne's research goals are to improve responses to AOD-related problems through innovative organisational and behaviour change initiatives. She's a major interest in the translation of research findings into practice, which of course is crucial in informing collaborations to support evidence-based best practice. Now, today, Anne will be speaking on exploring the impact of work in the workplace on alcohol and drug use, an absolutely crucial field of study. And in her talk, Anne will outline patterns and prevalence of AOD use among workers, workplace factors that can facilitate or exacerbate alcohol and other drug use, the role played by workplace cultures, and evidence-based strategies that may ameliorate AOD problems. Now, you can log your questions on the Q&A Zoom function, which I'll relay to Anne at the conclusion of the presentation. Please not on chat, on the Q&A. We may not be able to ask all of them. I'll do my best. And so if you can limit yourself to 2, please. And now, Anne, it's over to you.
Great. Thanks, Shane. It's a pleasure to be here with you and the team from NDARC and anybody else who's online today. So thank you very much for the opportunity to give this presentation. I too would like to, I'm just seeing if there we go, my slides were working. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land here in Adelaide, where I am, and that's the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains, and to pay my respects to elders past and present, to recognise and respect their cultural heritage, their beliefs and relationship with the land, and acknowledge that they are of continuing importance to the Kaurna people living here today. I'd also, at the outset, like to give you an indication of both what this presentation is about, but also acknowledge the large number of contributors to this body of work that I'm going to present. So I'm going to be talking about the world of work and workplace and its impact on people's alcohol and drug use, not so much the other way around. So I really want to juxtapose those differences between focusing on individuals who may have problematic alcohol and drug use or problems or use patterns where there may be risks associated with it. I want to contrast that with the very important role that context and environment, and in this instance workplace, plays in contributing and potentially exacerbating those sorts of problems. So this presentation is essentially a snapshot overview of 20 years and more work that's been conducted here through NCETA, and I'd like to very much acknowledge the work of one of our previous team members who's now retired, Associate Professor Ken Pitt, who stays with us as an adjunct. But much of the work that I'm presenting has been undertaken very much at his instigation, and we've executed, as I say, with quite a large group of researchers wrapping around that, and have partnered with many groups and organisations across Australia. So I'd like to give full recognition to those groups. So as I say, that what I'm going to cover here is essentially this overview of 20 years or more of the work that we've conducted in relation to alcohol and drug use and the workplace. So we've looked at things like the nature and extent of alcohol and drug use, patterns and prevalence, and some of the outcome measures of interest are there, absenteeism and injury. We've been intensively involved with costing projects that continue to this day, and I'll talk about those in a little more detail. We've undertaken numerous systematic reviews, both looking at interventions and the efficacy of strategies such as drug testing, and we're redoing many of those as we speak. We've also developed a theoretical model of work-related alcohol and drug use, which I think has been a really helpful guide to inform some of the interventions that we've run, a few of which I'll present at the end of this presentation. And recently, we also collaborated with a group from the United States to document the history of EAPs. And I'll speak a little bit about that and why historically that's important for us in terms of how we tend to conceptualize approaches that might be taken in this area. And all of this has informed the sorts of strategies and resources and the types of interventions we've been able to develop and implement over the interventions, particularly over the last decade. So we have quite a large array of publications and resources that we've compiled into a single document that can be accessed from our website there, that covers alphabetically this list of topics, so absenteeism, culture, drug testing, costings, and so forth. So if anybody's interested in any of the material that I'm presenting today, it's really easy to get hold of it, or just contact us. We can provide you with any of these things. And also, we've just recently completed, with some funding from SA Health, a really comprehensive standalone website that specifically looks in detail at alcohol and drugs in the workplace. This is yet to be launched, so it should be going live in the next few weeks, hopefully, but it's fully completed. And again, it's a compilation of much of our work, but work that's been done with colleagues around the world as well. So it's a very helpful practical tool to help transition between research and practice at the coalface. So in terms of this presentation, as I said, I'll give it a little bit of an overview of just a little bit of background about EAPs, because it sets the scene in some ways. Then talk a little bit more about the contemporary approaches to dealing with alcohol and drugs in the workplace, and our development of what we call a cultural model. And there's a terrific saying that says, culture beats strategy in the workplace always. So in organizational change terms, there's often an emphasis placed on developing sort of strategy and strategic frameworks and so forth. But the strong view is it's culture that makes a huge difference in terms of whether it's performance or productivity or behaviors of individuals within those organizations. I'll allude a little bit to the impact of COVID-19 and how that's playing out for us in terms of what's happened in relation to the escalation of precarious employment for many people, and that major change that we've all experienced throughout this year of working from home, and the sorts of implications that exist within that and what it might hold into the future for us as well. Then I'll change gear a little to talk in terms about the where, the how, and the what of what might be the problem that we're construing to be an issue around alcohol and drugs in the workplace. And then look at the other work that's being done in terms of systematic reviews. And as I said, some sample interventions that we've run, some with positive results, some not so, but important learnings from them. And then some key take-home messages. So that's pretty much the structure of this presentation as I work through it. So I'll just take a little sip here. So if we think about what's happening in terms of understanding and thinking about alcohol and drugs in the workplace today, it is really helpful to think what happened some decades ago that helped to lead us to the point we are now. And the piece of work that we completed looking at the international history of employee assistance programs, or EAPs, and how they were disseminated around the world over the last 3 or 4 or 5 decades, it's quite informative. So EAPs in America and a focus on alcohol and alcoholism in the workplace really gained great traction just after the Second World War in America, where they were attempting to rebuild their economy after the Second World War. And these initiatives were very heavily influenced by both political and economic forces at the time. There were high levels of alcoholism at that time. Consumption was much higher in both Australia and the United States. Workers, and predominantly male workers we're looking at here, were in short supply, partly as a result of the the ravages of the war, and they were certainly in high demand. They were seen as a very valued commodity, more or less an investment. And numbers of big companies instigated and invested in what were called industrial alcohol programs. And so big companies like DuPont and Eastman Kodak and General Motors and so forth. The focus was very individualistic. It was very much targeted at performance issues to identify people who may have had problems with alcohol and alcoholism. Not so much senior management or executives, but your middle and lower level workers. It very much pathologized alcohol and drug use. It had a very strong treatment orientation, so problems were really not identified until they'd become quite severe. And it ran in parallel with the growth of AA, and there was a very strong linkage between those. So it was reactive, it focused on maintaining and increasing productivity. And so that was the intention. How do you keep these workers being able to work as long as possible because they were needed for the economy? And by the 1970s, these industrial alcohol programs were renamed as EAP programs, and then they started to expand in orientation, and they looked at a wider range of issues, partly because that was the way they were intended to be recruited into these particularly distinctive forms of support programs, and then they were disseminated around the world. But they've very much, the EAP approach has very much informed lots of the work that's gone on in relation to alcohol and drugs in the workplace for some period of time. But in the last couple of decades, there's been some very important shifts, and some that we are very strongly supportive of. So the move away from just focusing on individual workers to a broader focus on the workplace and workplace culture is something that we say that the evidence is very strong on, and clearly indicates that you need to take this broader focus rather than simply downstream focus on individuals. There's also been some, particularly in Australia, changes in legislation. So there's a much stronger organisational duty of care. So employers and supervisors have a legal responsibility to provide a safe workplace for individuals. And the notion of corporate social responsibility plays a role in this as well. And over the intervening decades, we've seen a shift to not necessarily away from safety and cost and productivity, but we've seen a shift to broaden out that focus to one that also looks at the care and well-being of workers much more comprehensively and holistically. And so that now falls in concern around mental health and well-being. And it's worth noting that most of the workplace injury claims that are put forward these days are in relation to psychological injury, not physical injury. So issues around stress and anxiety really take prominence in that regard, as well as general worker well-being that might be related to sort of sleep and nutrition and sort of exercise, those sorts of things that fold in health promotion-y type programs. The other big shift was that where there was a preoccupation around alcohol last century, by the 80s and 90s, we became very concerned about illicits, as we still are today. And that shift in the late 80s and 90s, we keep pushing it back to say to organisations that we work with, to say most of your problems, most of your concerns are going to be about alcohol, not illicit drugs. And increasingly, they will be around pharmaceuticals and some of the prescribed opioids and benzos. So a big shift in relation to which drugs might be problematic. That at the early stages, and we talked about the origin of EAPs, the concern was often about middle-aged males. Then it shifted to looking at young people, young males, again in the 80s and 90s. And that now is moving, that pendulum is swinging back to look at what's happening with mid-aged males as well as younger people, and also increasingly women as their numbers in the workforce increase and their engagement with alcohol and drugs has changed substantially as well. And there have been lots of theoretical shifts over time that they tend to be congruent with the prevailing psychological theories of behaviour change, so social cognitive behaviour change issues, coping skills, role theory, those sorts of things, but more latterly towards looking at organisational change theory as we take this much broader focus. So lots of important changes that have occurred. But the key question for us is, why are we interested in the workplace at all? What is it that should occupy our time and our resources? And there's lots of persuasive arguments about why we should be really focusing on the workplace as a setting for both intervention and prevention. So we know that most people who use alcohol and drugs are in the paid workforce, and it provides an ideal intervention setting. So that in Australia, in the last year, in terms of illicit drug use, about 1.8 million workers have used illicit drugs in the last year, compared to 1 million not in the workplace. And I'll break that down a little bit further in a little while. But numerically, we have this large body of workers in a setting where they're potentially accessible for a large period of the day. There are also unique motivators that exist for behaviour change in the workplace settings. So workplace interventions have the potential to overcome many of the common barriers that might be encountered to treatment. So where drug use might not be perceived as a problem, in the workplace, it can certainly be framed as a problem in the context of someone's performance or lack of motivation to be able to execute their role or to be able to complete their work commitments. There are very tangible links that can be drawn in the workplace that sometimes are more difficult to draw outside of that. Sometimes for individuals too, that there's a difficulty in terms of lack of support. The workplace has a range of infrastructure opportunities whereby they can provide, and often in a very particular and specific way, additional supports to anybody needing those supports. And also people often have a lack of awareness about where they might be able to go for treatment and for intervention. And again, creating those pathways can be done much more readily through workplace infrastructures and opportunities. But as I said at the outset, our view is that the workplace is not a passive player in this at all, and that the focus should not simply be on the individual worker, but rather the workplace is an active agent. It's an active ingredient in the generation and the perpetuation of alcohol and drug problems. But it's not necessarily commonly construed as such, but we would argue there's very good evidence that this is the case, and even better evidence that some of those dynamic features can actually be manipulated to the advantage and to the benefit of both the individual workers and the workplace as a whole. So there's lots of features of the workplace that can contribute to problematic alcohol and drug use, and hence not only is it a great site for intervention, it's also an ideal site for prevention, which is where we spend much of our working lives, but still tends to be fairly much an overlooked opportunity. And that's true globally, not just in Australia. Some of the work that we've done here in Australia gets noticed in numbers of places around the world because there's simply not as much activity as you might expect. It gets carried out in this area. So one of the things that tends to be fairly convincing and persuasive when we're working with employer organisations and others in trying to sort of generate attention and funnel resources to this area is to look at what the costs are to alcohol and drug from alcohol and drugs to workplaces. And we've been doing numbers of studies for some time in this area, but most latterly we've been working with NDARC, who've been doing, NIDRI, to apologise, who've been doing studies looking at the specific costs of, and you'll see on the list there, that tobacco, methamphetamine, cannabis, opioids, and currently we're working on alcohol. And on an annual basis, we're looking at several $1 billion that gets incurred in terms of costs. Some of it's to do with absenteeism, less so to do with injury, and some data allows us to look at issues such as presenteeism, which we don't have good data in Australia on that. But nonetheless, the cost is really substantial and it's amenable to improvement, which is a very important message. The other thing that's important for us in trying to generate interest and encourage people to engage in this area is that we have much better understanding about the motivations for people's use of alcohol and drugs. And so it's helpful when we're talking to organisations to help them think in terms of these basic fundamental concepts, such as, the 3 Ps of alcohol and drug use. That people use because it's pleasurable, they use because it's purposeful, and in the workplace that can be quite a salient motivator, or they might be using for either physical or emotional pain relief. And holding those concepts in mind help to drive the sorts of assessments that need to be undertaken and the sorts of parallel interventions that are relevant to very specific workplaces. And it's also helpful to think in terms of how we use all sorts of different substances and how we regulate and shape our behaviour in that way. So coffee and alcohol are 2 great examples of that. They tend to be markers of key points in the day. So coffee certainly starts my day, but they're also symbolic as well as they can be functional. And drawing these parallels in workplace environments help people to see alcohol and drug use through different and new lenses, and that can be helpful to inform interventions. And similarly, some of the work of Jim Alford was really helpful here. So supervision and structure tends to be essential for managing high-risk behaviours, or as he describes them, as appetitive behaviours. And as we've seen in the last year through working from home and COVID-19 isolation, where time has ceased to have any bearing on, as one person described, when they were sleeping, eating, watching TV or so forth, we need structure and supervision to regulate some of these more potentially risky and potentially problematic behaviours. So supervision and structure in the workplace are very powerful tools for us. So my theme here is that it's not just a worker and it's not just about the individuals, but rather that alcohol and drug problems can be construed as located within the worker, but workplace factors, context and culture can and do contribute to and exacerbate these problems. And they might include exposure factors, so exposure to environmental or ergonomic or psychological stresses, and they may be physical things such as hot, dry, dusting environments. And so we've worked with organisations and industries where they had high levels of problematic alcohol use. But when people were coming off really hot mine sites, for instance, they were often either provided free alcohol or heavily subsidised alcohol before they could even get to water. And so sometimes very basic changes were really helpful. We also know that the level of stress that people work under, whether they're overworked or underworked, makes a difference in terms of how they react in terms of their use of alcohol and drugs, whether they're stressed in terms of exposure to dangers. Shift work makes an enormous difference because lack of supervision potentially, or the need for certain drugs to help them stay alert at times that they'd normally be asleep. And low supervision is a classic one as well. We've worked very closely with some of the fishing industries, for instance, where there's offshore fishing, where you have high risk takers who work under very low supervision. And we know that there's often been very high problems around heroin use, for instance. And so managing those problems in terms of lack of supervision is the structural thing to be addressed, not just the behaviour of the individual worker. And similarly, the issues that have arisen more latterly from working from home are quite important, because we know that there are new stresses and strains, there are new issues about lack of supervision, and new working constraints altogether, and we're not quite sure how that's playing out yet. There are numbers of studies that have been done just in the last 6 months, and so we have a very uneven and irregular pattern of drug use, some going up, some going down, so we're still finding our way with that. But we do know that we're in a period of precarious employment that is going to be particularly risky and challenging for many individuals, and then likely to play a role in increased alcohol and drug use. So I said at the outset that we had developed a new conceptual framework for looking at alcohol and drugs in the workplace, and this was developed between Ken Pitt and myself some years ago. And so it essentially says that this is a complex phenomenon that we're dealing with when you're looking at alcohol and drug use in the workplace. So there's numbers of things to be considered. There's a whole suite of external factors, and so pre-existing attitudes and beliefs and behaviours, the set of values and behaviours and so forth that people bring from the external world to the workplace, and social and cultural norms of the wider community play a very important role in terms of what might happen in the workplace. Similarly, working conditions, as I've just been describing, they also might contribute and play out in terms of types of alcohol and drug use that we're likely to see. But importantly also, what the workplace puts in place or can put in place in terms of control factors. So these are some of the brakes, such as physical and social availability, and the armed forces are a classic example of where there used to be very wide and open access to alcohol and tobacco. And that's changed very substantially because they recognise the harms that are associated with too wider availability of certain substances. The role played by alcohol policy, we'll speak at in depth in a little while, because that's the pivot point for how you can actually change things, and the evidence, and there again, the empirical evidence is very good about that. And certainly things like supervision levels and so forth. And when you've got workers in environments with low visibility, that's a potentially problematic work environment for them. But in addition to that, you also see a range of workplace customs and practices. So we've worked closely with construction industries, for instance, and there are certain practices where alcohol might play an integral part in the construction of a site. And so a slab of beer will be sort of brought out when they reach a certain point in the construction. So it's very reinforcing. It's very important part of team cohesion, and it's an important part of celebrating the successes that they achieve in their working environment. And these things also make a tremendously important contribution to levels of use. But it's a combination of these factors that both shape and drive alcohol and drug use. So it's not just about the individual. So if we turn to this question about, well, where is the problem? Who's the problem? What's the problem? Then we start to dive into some of the data that's available to us, and we're able to disaggregate it a little bit further. And it's helpful here, I think, to think of some of Carol Backey's work when she has done some work in the alcohol and drug area, as in elsewhere, looking at what's the problem represented to be. And it's important, I think, to think about what is it that we're concerned about? What are we defining as being problematic use? But what we do know is levels of alcohol and drug use are not equally and evenly distributed across industries and occupational groups. There are statistically significant differences that exist even when you control for age and gender. And those differences exist for a reason, and we need to look at what are the factors that underlie those, that underpin those. And in any of our responses, it's those underpinning factors that need to be responded to. And the responses need to be tailored to those individual settings. So if we look here, this is the 2016, not yet 2019, but soon, data from the National Drug Strategy Household Survey, that when we break down, there's essentially about 19 industry groups that we can analyse across Australia. And here we've looked at short-term risky drinking on a weekly basis and broken it down by industry of employment. And so you see about 17% or so, about 20% of Australians would be drinking at a risky level on a weekly basis. But there are certain industries and occupations where the level of consumption is substantially higher than that. So we can start to identify who are these at-risk industry and occupational groups. So we've done that also for methamphetamine, and you don't see the same pattern replicated consistently by industry group. There are some important variations by drug type. So again, we're able to develop a fairly nuanced understanding of which industry groups and which demographics within those groups are using what sorts of substances in a potentially elevated and risky way. Similarly, the same pattern that exists for cannabis, where you see these really significant differences by different employment groups. In general, we'd argue that the higher risk workforces tend to be young workers and blue-collar trade groups. That's in general, and it doesn't always break down in that way. And that in general, there are industry groups such as agriculture, construction, manufacturing, mining for alcohol, but not so much these days for illicit drugs, and hospitality. But we're able now, as I say, to look at this in much finer and more fine-grained detail. So that's in terms of the 19 industry groups. When you look at it by the 5 main occupational groups, so certainly tradespeople tend to be some of the riskier consumers of alcohol, but then so do managers. So it's not necessarily just blue-collar workers alone that form our high-risk groups. And you're not meant to look at this in detail, but at the moment what we're doing is taking our 19 industry groups and our 5 occupational groups to break it down further to see what the correlation is between those two. And so you can see that in some industry groups highlighted in the yellow boxes, so it's the managers or the professionals that might be the high risk consumers of, in this instance, it's illicit drugs, and rather than making these generalized assumptions. And this really helps to inform our risk assessments. The other issue for focusing on the workplace is this question about when we look at our data and we tend to look at the prevalence of, say, illicit drugs, we know that there tends to be higher prevalence amongst people who are unemployed compared to people who are in the paid workforce. But numerically, as you will see from this graph here for methamphetamine, so there are, proportionally, a higher proportion of people that amongst the unemployed who use, but numerically they are significantly fewer. So again, the bulk of the population that we're interested in intervening with are actually in the paid workforce. Even though we do know that the profile of methamphetamine users who are unemployed tends to be quite different to those who are in employment. They tend to have severer problems, higher levels of use, higher levels of injecting, higher levels of psychosocial problems and mental health problems. So I'm not conflating them necessarily, but highlighting that there's huge opportunity for accessing very, very large numbers of people who are employed. Similarly with cannabis, similar relationship, not quite as prominent as it is for methamphetamine, but another good argument for us to be focusing on the workplace. So a couple of other general issues are about, so we want to make distinctions about the workforce use, about when do people use overall away from the workplace. And so you might be using in a way that might contribute indirectly to safety and productivity. So a lot of alcohol or illicit drug use on the weekend may well impact your productivity and safety issues on the Monday. But when we know that we have very high levels of both illicit drug use and risky alcohol consumption, use away from the workforce can be equally as important as the use that occurs in the workforce. So, or at the workplace, where we get much, much lower levels of use reported actually at the workplace itself. So it tends to be the generic pattern of a worker's use that we're interested. And there's different, oops, I'll just go back. There's different types of drugs that tend to be used by people outside of work as opposed to in the workplace itself. But just knowing what these patterns look like will help for a fairly fine-grained assessment of risk. And so that's what we want. What are the implications for risk management? And so these are the sorts of things that we're now able to do with our highly differentiated analysis of the data available to us. We can identify who the high-risk workforce groups are by occupation and industry. We're able to look at them in terms of workforce demographics by age and gender, by rurality, by CEFA, socioeconomic status, metropolitan, rural locations, a whole variety of different demographics, and that can inform our risk assessment. We really do stress that most of our concern is around alcohol rather than illicits, because that's where the bulk of harm occurs. But this information will help us provide these tailored responses that we know are more effective, and stressing to the groups that we work with that really it's a whole of workplace approach that's needed, not just focusing on targeting an individual who might have a problem, but looking at everyone across the whole workplace and having everybody involved in both policy and intervention development that moves towards a different cultural set of norms in those workplaces. So where we've worked quite proactively and at very close range with numbers of groups, what we suggest to them is we undertake a risk assessment and a gap analysis with them in the first instance, so that we can identify in some degree of specificity what's relevant for either their industry or their particular organisation, and from there develop some quite tailored response strategies. So in no way are we suggesting that there's a one-size-fits-all response, and I'll give you an example from our own work which showed how that did not work. The other thing that we've done is spend a bit of time looking at, well, what are those risk and protective factors? So the antecedents and consequences of potential harm in the workplace. And so starting to identify those and articulate those allows us to look in terms of how can we tip the balance to ensure that there are more protective factors in any particular workplace and fewer risk factors. But we can only do that by assessing those on an individual basis or an industry basis. Now, the range of options that have been identified internationally, these are the stock standard sort of sets of responses that evidence suggests are most effective. So you start with a formal policy. After that, supervisor training, and that might be training around policy, it might be training around communication, it might be training around informing supervisors about what kind of referral networks are available to them and support mechanisms and so forth. Then moving down to that much more individualized level at looking at education for specific groups of workers, and then ensuring that there are really good either EAP or referral mechanisms in place. The kind of B list here, if you like, is the range of other additional options that workplaces might include. And they include things like alcohol and drug testing. And alcohol and drug testing is in that category for a very specific reason, in terms of how good the evidence is of its efficacy. And I'll do a little side tangent in a moment and talk you through some of the reasons there. And there's a range of other things such as health promotion programs, brief interventions, peer interventions, and psychoskills training. But the evidence is not as strong for some of those. But drug testing is always a perennial topic. And so just in these next couple of slides, I'll just give you a bit of a snapshot about some of the key issues here. So we know that it can be an effective strategy, but some major caveats apply to that. And that it's, in terms of the most effective part, it can be effective if it is part of a much more comprehensive and wide-scale tailored set of responses, but it's very limited in terms of its effectiveness as a standalone strategy, unfortunately. And it also can have potentially negative outcomes. So behaviours among workers might change to avoid detection rather than stopping use or reducing the risk that it's meant to address. And it can also lead to the reluctance to report minor accidents or near misses in workplaces, which is a really a negative outcome overall. So we've done numbers of things. We ran systematic reviews looking at the efficacy of drug testing from the available literature, and we have another one that's underway right at the moment. So there's two main arguments for drug testing. One is deterrence and one is to improve safety. But in both instances, there's very limited evidence of a deterrent effect. A few good studies, quality studies that are available. And in terms of deterrence, it kind of depends on the associated sanctions that might go with it. And there's always the concern that the gambler's fallacy might apply, so that where people believe that they're going to be exempt from this, or they're not going to be caught in this kind of net. It won't apply to them, so they'll be fine. So there may also be some long-term impact of sanctions that are problematic, that can further stigmatise and marginalise already vulnerable individuals, and it may hamper people getting into treatment. So these are really unfortunate consequences that we would consider highly undesirable. And in terms of improving safety, again, the evidence is simply not strong in that regard. And we do know that the mechanisms that are available for testing can only really tell you whether somebody has consumed an illicit drug previously. For alcohol, it's different, but it provides little evidence of a causal role of alcohol or drugs contributing to any potential harm. So that, in terms of its safety role, it really is quite limited in terms of what it can do. And again, it can have some unexpected negative impacts on safety and people changing their behaviours, and it may well be displacement effects from moving from less harmful substances to more harmful substances to avoid detection. So that's problematic. But nonetheless, it's extremely popular, and that's for numbers of reasons. It's fast and easy to implement. It gives a biological marker which removes that subjective component that people might feel that they're being sort of targeted or victimised in some ways. And it has a symbolic function for some organisations where they're able to say, well, we're doing the right thing, we're doing what we should be doing. And it's been very heavily and effectively marketed by providers. And it's got all the elements of a compelling idea. So there's it's driven by wider social concerns, its implementation and support occurs regardless of what the evidence base is. And as I said, it can be useful, but it's in no way a silver bullet and needs to be treated with sort of care. But it's policy that we would argue is absolutely the key to looking at how you can change those risks in a particular work environment, change the cultural norm, reduce the harms and potential hazards. So, and there's an empirical base for arguing this. So policy is pivotal, and we've produced numbers of resources to help people develop policies that they can use. So we did an analysis again of some of this household survey data. That there's a set of questions in there about whether people were aware whether their workplace had policies or not, and we asked it asks in a series of different questions, and it's quite clear that alcohol policy awareness was related to a significantly decreased odds of risky drinking, and a comprehensive policy, an awareness of a comprehensive policy, was related to a significant decrease of the odds of someone being a drug user, whereas there was no relationship shown for drug testing. So, but policy can do a range of things. It demonstrates that organisations are taking reasonable steps to mitigate any kind of risk, clarifies the roles and expectations of working in a particular environment. It can certainly increase knowledge and skills in terms of responding to alcohol and drug incidents, and it promotes an inclusive and positive, healthy workplace culture, which is really a positive thing to do. And it encourages workers to proactively seek help, as well as meeting sort of employers' obligations and so forth. So that's kind of what we know about what happens in workplaces. What does the evidence tell us about what the data can inform in terms of really tailored risk assessments and gap analysis, and what's the evidence in terms of interventions that can be undertaken. So I'll give you 4 examples now of some of the work that we've actually then undertaken as trials to implement some of these this evidence base. So one that we undertook between 2012 and 14, we looked at psychosocial skills development training for young workers in commercial cookery in New South Wales. And here we were particularly interested in young people who were transiting, sometimes from school into the workforce, or sometimes into their first work role. We know that cookery apprentices and working in hospitality is another high-risk environment. And so we undertook some qualitative work with the second-year trainees to say what were their experiences like. And it was quite an eye-opener. It's a very stressful working environment for them. And so the things that they said would be helpful to them would be things like stress management, improving their communication skills, improving their understanding about harms and prevention strategies associated with alcohol and drugs. So from that study, we got good results. So they were clearly a high-risk group for alcohol and drug-related harm. And from the trainers at TAFE, they said that generally they tended to deteriorate over time. So intervening early with the first-year group had considerable merit. So we found at post-intervention that there were reductions in risky alcohol use, significant reductions in psychological distress measured by K10, and increased workplace communication skills and increased stress coping skills. So that was quite a positive outcome. And so what we did then was we took that package and then we applied it to a different group of young workers in South Australia. And then this time we applied it to first-year trainees in the construction industry. Now, we didn't do any of the preliminary work in terms of the focus groups and really tailoring the intervention to the specific needs of that group. But again, these were a high-risk group for alcohol and drugs and poor psychological well-being. But what we found was no intervention effect, unfortunately. So what we found here was that our big learning was that whilst these 2 groups were really high-risk groups of young people, and workplace psychosocial factors certainly play a role in both instances, but the psychoskills training needs to be tailored to the particular occupational groups. You can't take one and just rebadge it and apply it to another group. You need something that's much more specific to the needs of individual groups. The third one that I'll show, which is here, what we attempted to do was take that more comprehensive model of workplace culture and how it impacts alcohol and drug use, and we applied it here to a Vic Health funded 3-year trial where Vic Health contacted us and said, we want you to apply for this money. And so here we ran a 3-year trial across 4 Victorian manufacturing sites and different population of workers. They're not young necessarily, but of all age groups. And we worked with 2 intervention and 2 control sites here. And what we did was we applied the key elements of our cultural model. So we looked at policy development, we looked at employee education and training. Importantly, and probably one of the most salient features of this was supervisor training, and it was embedded within the day-to-day production processes of those particular workplaces. And here we saw an increase in alcohol and drug policy awareness and referral pathways. We saw improved workplace communication and improved supervisor confidence. So the supervisors were saying to us, I can now raise all sorts of issues with workers, whether it's about alcohol or drugs or their marital problems or financial problems. We can now talk and communicate much more effectively than previously. But it did decrease, but non-significantly, risky drinking and alcohol-related incidents. So it was heading in the right direction, but not significantly so. But these are the coal faces that we're working at, and we're really challenging working environments to run these in vivo studies in. So, and again, it was a long 3-year project where we undertook a gap analysis and risk assessment in the first instance, and then tailored the interventions specifically to the needs of these particular workplaces, and then did ongoing implementation before we did our outcome evaluation. So it was intensive but very fruitful. So I'll skip this in the interest of time. The last one I'll draw to your attention is one that we've just completed. And again, it was working with the construction industry and based primarily in Sydney and around sort of the north coast of New South Wales. And this was a New South Wales funded project that we undertook in collaboration with the New South Wales Building Trades Group. And so they're a group that some of you would be familiar with, that's been in existence for quite a period of time and have been very proactively engaged in supporting their workforce in relation to alcohol and drugs. And they provide a referral pathway to their treatment service at Foundation House. And so they're quite an interesting group. They take this philosophical approach to alcohol and drugs that operates on these principles here. If you choose to use alcohol and drugs, that's your business. But if you choose to do it in the workplace or in a way that impacts the workplace, then it's our business. And if you want to stop or you want some help, we can help you. And so they've been running training programs for a period of time. And so we were invited to participate to undertake the evaluation of this. So we did, to see whether their training of, in this instance, of just the workers, whether that made an impact in terms of risky drinking and drug use, their knowledge of harms, their attitudes, and their awareness of treatment options. So what we found with this group at the initial baseline, so we had over 500 of these workers, the AOD prevalence levels were exceptionally high, higher than what we were picking up in our national survey data. So 3 out of 4 were definitely risky drinkers. Cocaine and methamphetamine was 3.5 times higher than the national average. Prescribed painkiller use was 3 times the national average. And there was disturbingly a very high concurrent use of both prescribed opioids and alcohol by all age groups, but particularly the mid-age males. And it's worth noting that the opioid crisis that continues in the United States at the moment, some of the research from there indicates that construction workers have an overdose death rate that's 6 to 7 times higher than comparable occupational groups. So this is a very high risk and vulnerable population. And we also then found extremely high levels of cocaine use, which we've now seen borne out in the 2019 household survey data, and very low levels of risk awareness in general. So this is some of our baseline data that I won't speak to in too much detail, but just showing exceptionally high levels of alcohol and drug use and very high levels of concurrent use. So if you take the people who were the risky alcohol users, they were also, particularly the young workers and the mid-aged workers, very high levels of both cocaine and prescription painkillers. That was true for the young people. We're not quite sure why they're so heavy users of prescription drugs and painkillers. But the mid-age group here, that's alcohol and painkillers. So that's a risk group for overdose. So the implications of this study here was that AOD use remains very high for this group. We need to target both young groups, young workers and middle-aged workers, and in focusing our attention on these concurrent levels of use, not just single levels of use. And so looking at multi-level responses that might include both education and culture change. So we found that in this particular trial, the participants rated training very highly, so that was great. From time 1 to time 2, we can certainly increase knowledge and understanding of impairment factors and awareness of risk and so forth. So between time 1 and time 2, immediately after training. But at time 3, which was some 3 to 5 months later, there was a substantial loss to follow-up, unfortunately. So we have to be very careful about how we interpret those findings. And there were no significant improvements for illicit drug use measures at time 3, but there were significantly fewer people categorised as risky drinkers by Audit C in our training group. So some very positive outcomes overall, but we do know that some much more intensive work is required. So what it does do is flag for us how very high the need is for intervention and support in many of these high risk workplace population groups. So last couple of slides. So our key takeaway messages are things like this. The workplace is really underutilized as an intervention and prevention site. Huge potential. It's only just, we're just starting to scratch the surface of that. Partnerships are absolutely crucial. In nearly all instances, we've worked very, very closely with key industry groups, business groups, the TAFE training sector. So absolutely crucial to have those sorts of partnerships to make it possible. And you certainly need both employee and union involvement. So without that becomes fraught with difficulty. But nonetheless, these in vivo studies are still fraught with challenge. They're extremely difficult and they're quite fragile to get them through to completion. There's no manner of barriers and challenges that one encounters. But clearly what we find is that there is no one size that fits all, that there's a range of different strategies that are needed for the different workplaces and the different population groups and the different contexts and environments in which people work. So we really are needing to look for much more tailored and individualized, not by individual people, but individualized to those organizations and workplace settings. So the other thing that the evidence is telling us globally is that a couple of recent reviews here, one from 2020, a systematic review of the effectiveness of employee-led interventions. High quality studies are still lacking. So this is a research greenfield site for many of us. So there's around the world, there's only been, I say, a smallish number of active researchers who've chipped away in a dedicated way for some period of time. But similarly, the effectiveness of workplace interventions for reducing alcohol, still weak evidence for workplace interventions, largely because we are not getting in there and running enough studies and enough studies that are really rigorous to give us the evidence base that we need. So this is the cusp that we're at the moment. There's terrific opportunity to do some really first-rate research in these environments. So into the future, we're increasingly needing to look at the importance of identifying and addressing emergent needs of workers, and especially the implications of working from home and job insecurity, job loss, and the economic downturn, and the impact that it has on the working environment for people, and how that then interrelates with alcohol and drug use. We need to place a greater emphasis also on our work-life balance, mental health issues, certainly alcohol and drug use, and family and domestic violence that now is coming much more to the surface, and working with employers and governments to ensure that they focus on ways to re-establish our economic stability and restore productivity patterns for Australia into the future, and helping to contain and improve our alcohol and drug related problems will certainly be very important and pivotal to that. So just finally, as a reminder, that lots of the things that I've talked about here are available in that collated document that you can get from our website. And shortly we'll be releasing our very new Alcohol and Drugs in the Workplace website, supported by SA Health, and that will be a central repository of much of this information to help anybody that's interested in both working at the coalface or undertaking much needed research in this area. So thank you for your time today.
Great, thank you very much, Anne. Excellent presentation. Cook's tour of the century, really, isn't it? Look, I've got a question from the good Professor Anthony Shakeshaft, who makes a comment, thanks Anne, very interesting as usual. And he said, do you have any sense about whether people are generally receptive to DNA interventions through their workplace? He's just wondering, for example, whether young people in construction would resist talking about drug and alcohol use.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and it depends on who you're talking to. So often we get invited to organizations by middle management, senior management, because they detect problems, and of all sorts of problems. They often want to direct our attention to illicits, and we want to redirect it back to alcohol, or they want to focus more on drug testing and severe penalties, and we're wanting to move towards changing elements of the workplace culture. So they tend to be receptive because of that issue of cost. We can sell it to them because we can show ways to improve worker absenteeism that's alcohol and drug related, and productivity and so forth. So they're attracted by that. For the workers themselves, it's really quite a challenging thing. And our concern about the veracity of some of our data that we collect when we're running our studies is to what extent we get donkey votes on some of our survey tools and our data collection mechanisms. But we do find over time that the process of developing relationships with the participants becomes really important. And so often people would come and seek you out individually to have conversations, or it might be a team leader who wants to have some further conversations because they know that there are problems, even if they've participated in a lot of the cannabis use or meth use on site and things like that, that they can see potential harms associated with it. So it's a very mixed bag. And in some ways, trying to just change the knowledge and attitudes of the workers themselves is what we keep saying is it's a really limited strategy. You want to change the culture, and there's other things that inform the culture. So it can be a small component of it, but it is the bigger picture that we're really trying to target.
Okay. And this area is difficult by nature, isn't it not? But got a question from Emila Sriskanda. Are employers allowed to force workers to have drug testing? I'm uncertain. What's the legal status of drug testing in an industry?
That's a really good question, and we've regularly get phone calls from lawyers about this. When policies are being implemented, so one of the things that's crucial in the development of policy is that workers, unions, and everybody else is involved in the development of that policy and can have a say, and they're informed about what kind of drug testing policies might be put in place. So that's the first step. Once you take a job in a working environment where it is part of their drug policy, then you don't have a legal out in relation to that. But there are other issues about how invasive that drug testing might be. And so one of the question that was put to us not long ago was taking saliva swabs is one thing. Taking urine samples under scrutiny is another thing altogether. And so there's legal issues there that people can say, well, I'm not about to have somebody observe me as I'm passing urine, and sometimes to do it in a much more invasive way than that. And so that's a much grayer area about what your legal rights might be. But certainly employers are legally entitled to it, particularly if it's part of your employment contract and the policy, which should be known to everybody in the organisation. So you sign up for it.
So it comes under contract law.
Yes, to a very large extent.
Yeah. By the way, Donna Bull says, thanks and very interesting. Just a comment, congratulations on the development of the new website, a fantastic resource. I think we can all echo that. There's two questions which I think are related to one another. Got one, do any of these interventions involve time away from work or rehab, and do they receive pay during this time? And Anthony said, again, and I think this is the same type of question, is there buy-in for employees to pay for interventions? So I said, is there a cost to the employers if a problem's identified and the person requires treatment?
I think that's covered by workers' compensation. And so there's lots of legislation around that. So it's out of our kind of remit, but that gets covered quite readily, which I think that's a bit separate to the question about, is there a cost for the intervention of running the programs? And there can be, but many organisations get recompense for providing training of different sorts to their workers, and so it can fall under that umbrella as well.
Yeah. We've got a question from Paul Watkins from ODI Australia. Thanking you for the presentation, and talking about tailored interventions. And Paul's just wondering, how would you go about ascertaining what areas of assist in any given workplace needs? Because one of the major things you've been pointing out in your research across the decades is it's not a one size fits all.
So I think the first one is looking at what the demographic profile is of the workforce. And so there's some things there that can be generalized. And so that's helpful. So there's a few shortcuts there. And particularly as we build a repository of information, saying that the data that's available nationally, where we can break it down by industry and occupational groups, so we know that these groups are likely to be using at a higher prevalence level and likely to be experiencing more difficulties. And as I said, that we're really only scratching the surface of that now, but we're doing that by a whole range of demographic variables. So that's a helpful one. The second issue is in terms of what are the specific elements of the workplace environment that might be relevant. So a very specific example is that we were contracted to do some work by some refuelers. I have to be careful about this. Refuelers at an airport where there was major concern about illicit drug use because it's a highly safety sensitive issue. So unless the refueling process is done really precisely and accurately, there can be catastrophic consequences. So the working environment becomes really important in terms of what are the risks associated with drug use, whereas in another environment there may be relatively low level consequences. So you want to up the ante in terms of the types of responses that you put in place. So there's those things. The other one is that trying to get a sense from both the workers and supervisors of what are the things that they would find helpful. And both the focus groups that we ran with the TAFE students in Sydney and working with the manufacturing groups in Melbourne, that there were some really interesting and surprising findings from that they really did want skills around communication, because a lot of it was about, I don't know how to have conversations with people about whether it's their alcohol and drug use or maybe a mental health problem or some other sensitive, so dealing with sensitive issues. So that can be informative. So the risk assessment can, I think, be done without a complex process, and it can be highly informative. Yeah.
I got one final question from Fadil Paddock from New South Wales Health, and just asking about would national workers' bodies such as the ACTU, would that be impactful, or does it need to go at specific union level or site level?
I think it depends if you're talking about the development of policy. So we've worked with numbers of unions who specifically, the unions have come to us and said, we want your advice and input in terms of developing policy that sees issues from the union's perspective, which is quite interesting. And some of them have been very, very different issues that arise in different working areas. So the role of unions and the role of the different industries do vary very substantially. But having said that, I think that there's real scope for ACTU to have this overarching imprimatur about the importance of doing this. Yeah. And it's important on multiple levels. So that can be a generic blanket level of support. And then after that, move into the much more kind of tailored, nuanced responses. Yeah, that's great. Look, that's been a brilliant seminar, and I know that in the course of an hour, the amount of work that's gone in those decades, it's a staggering amount of work, and as you point out, there are not a lot of people who have persisted doing that work and continue, and we thank you for that. I think it's been magnificent, and it's a great talk. Thank you so much, but I'd really like to give credit again to our team who've worked on this. So absolutely, a lot of people have worked on this in NCETA, and we've worked together on it. So yeah, of course. Shane. Look, as this is the last webinar for the year, I'd like to thank those behind the scenes who have made the series possible: Gemma Sale, Jacob Webb, Lee Smeller, Deb Owen, Rachel Sutherland, and Emily Stockings, and of course you, the speakers and the audience. In our webinars, we've aimed to both inform and entertain. So I hope we've achieved some small success in our endeavours. We will be back in 2021, which I assure you statistically must regress to the mean of normality and be better than 2020. That would not be difficult, I can assure you, but have faith. And once again, thank you, Anne, and I wish you all a good afternoon and evening. Thank you. Thanks, Shane.